name is Samer Frangi. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Studies and Public Administration, and I'm moderating what I think is the last panel in our 2 days conference entitled Post-Secularism, Arab Societies and Islam. We will be following the order that was presented in the program, and we will start with Dr. Fuad Halbouni, who just finished his PhD from Johns Hopkins University Anthropology Department. His work tackles the question of the circulation of public religious speech and the remaking of community, and his dissertation is entitled Between Promise and Disappointment, the Sectarian Question After Tahrir. Each of our speakers will talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we can take questions from the audience. So please join me in welcoming Fuad.
I'd like to thank everyone for lasting that long. Please bear with me. It's like an introductory talk. I don't claim big words. And another thing is that I haven't slept for 24 hours just out of anxiety. So hopefully all will go well.
You're not supposed to admit to that,
All right. So I'd like to begin. The title has not changed. It's called In Defense of Islam's Image, Saba Mahmoud and the Coptic Question. So in a note on the ethnographic methods conducted in her latest and last monograph, Religious Difference in a Secular Age, a Minority Report, Saba Mahmoud explains how she had spent a period of 15 months among a group of human rights activists, advocates, and lawyers that worked on cases related to religious freedoms in Egypt. Mahmoud worked primarily in an organization known as the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, which offers legal services and aid to people belonging to minority groups such as the member of the Coptic, Baha'i, and Ahmadiyya communities that suffer cases of discrimination. Although in her note, she expresses gratitude to the initiative's legal staff that assisted her in understanding how grievances of different minority groups are mediated and translated through different languages of human rights systems and Egyptian civil law, it is only after her departure from Egypt she realizes that the initiative's legal staff are not completely aware of the normative frameworks that govern and underlie the concepts of religious liberty, tolerance, and minority rights. They seem not to be completely aware of the histories and colonial legacies which lie behind those concepts in practice. It is as if the hidden histories of such concepts in practice retain a certain opacity to her informants. The assumptions that informed their work were not simply theirs, she writes, but belonged to a global political discourse that exerts an immense force on our collective imagination, end quote. It is only during the second phase of the ethnographic labor, the phase of writing an analysis, that she can understand and establish the temporal links between the concepts in practice and their histories, which emanate from a global grammar of political governance, she reminds us. It is as if the hidden historical dimensions of such concepts unfold and their full temporal weight, the temporality and historicity of the discourse of human rights systems that is bear upon her analysis of political secularism. My book, she announces, could not have been born without the ethnographic encounter, but also had to transcend it. And I emphasize this word, to transcend it in order to make sense of what I encountered. Her anthropological endeavor, in other words, does not simply employ participant observation for the purpose of analyzing how people think or behave in a given society, but to understand the normative frameworks which we use to apprehend life as such. In this last statement, I think she exhibits this movement of analysis from an analysis of political secularism as political doctrine toward the secular as generative of certain forms of life and ethical sensibilities. Mahmoud's ethnographic methods is in harmony with her conceptual analysis. In different sections of her book, she seems not to be interested in tracing a local genealogical analysis of those concepts, nor following their ideational life. I mean, I translate this into like traveling theory perhaps. But she wants to examine their overlapping histories between Europe and the Middle East, as well as analyzing their evolving patterns from the former, from Europe to the later, the Middle East. My own critical intervention seems to rest on her, what I see as inattentiveness to the local genealogy of concepts as well as their ideational life. I simply claim that the local history of concepts and the type of moral investments they carry for local non-Muslim communities disrupt those very neat conceptual shifts which Mahmoud makes to highlight the overlapping histories of political secularism between the center and the peripheries. If Mahmoud has kindly alluded to a certain blind spot on the part of local activists, I would like also to affirm why local histories of concepts are important. I simply claim that those histories in the plural tell you a different story of what is exactly at stake for the Coptic community, their moral investments in the promise of citizenship, and actually it is her term, the promise of citizenship, and how they perceive its failures, paradoxes, and disappointments over time. Two reviewers have examined the conceptual stakes in Mahmoud's last book. Michael Allen, a literature professor who engaged in dialogue with Saba Mahmoud over the past years, defends her analytical approach as an exercise in critical anthropology which allows her to shift between the peculiarity of her cases and the normative framework which govern our apprehension of communal life, as I mentioned earlier. In other words, her focus on tracing overlapping histories of the concepts of religious liberty and minority rights allows her to examine how the secular as an episteme permeates the domain of law, gender, and religion, and it allows her a certain flexibility of movement in addressing all those domains. In a different essay dedicated to Mahmoud's work, Richard Hefner traces the major conceptual and methodological shifts between her two books. He highlights how her earlier work, The Politics of Piety, has a different logic of inquiry than her latest book, A Minority Report. In her first book, Mahmoud makes a move from micro-social practices related to the everyday life of her subject to an analysis of the normative framework which animates our political imagination. The Politics of Piety, Hefner writes, has less to do with the grand sweeping genealogies of the later sort than with her highlighting of the micro-social ethical practices whereby women in the Egyptian piety movement aim to reconstruct their bodies and minds, to uphold a discursive tradition that regards subordination to a transcendent will, and thus in many instances to male authority as its coveted goal, end quote. And so my criticism or my interventions are divided into three interrelated points, and sorry that I wrote them in a swift manner. So I hope that I'm kind of making sense. So my first point, as mentioned in an earlier section, Mahmoud focused on the global grammar of human rights, of how it transforms and reshapes the religious lives of the Coptic community. However, she rarely attends to the figure of the Copt and his place in an Islamic state to come, and especially in the literatures of Islamic revival movements. I simply mean whether we could find seeds of an ethical thematization of Coptic-Muslim relations in such bodies of literature. By ethical thematization, I mean the final paragraph of Saba's last book that ends almost in aporia. In her first book on sorry, I apologize, I moved to another book. In his first book on ethical soundscapes of Islamic sermons, Charles Hirschkind hints to the ways Islamic revival movements have addressed the concerns of the Coptic community during the high tide of violent attacks on the community. But he does it in a footnote towards the very end of his monograph. In my own research, I have discovered that the Coptic community is somehow always treated as a problem in the social, political fabric of that state to come, or how it was envisioned in the literatures of in a lot of the Islamic revival movements in the 80s. I highlight here the works of Islamic legal theorist Tariq al-Bishri and his magisterial work, الأقباط والمسلمون في إطار الجماعة الوطنية, Muslims and Copts within the framework of national community, and the ways in which his notion of national community, it becomes some kind of the framework by which that Copts and Muslim relations should always remain contained. In other words, that it's a very secularized also notion of national community. And in that sense, he wants to, in many ways, that he wants to see the Islamic revival movements as not something that is outside of the body of the nation, but as a kind of a continuation of decolonization efforts, or in what the early national liberation movements have failed. In other words, that the Islamic revival movements are not just a violent outbreak with the national body, but could commemorate it. And in that sense, he wants still the Copts to be held by the contract that was based in the 1919 revolution, which commemorated this idea of national unity, that we all are assimilated into that national body. Whenever a Copt wishes to speak as a Copt, ultimately, he changes, he is being viewed as sectarian. In short, I claim that many Islamic thinkers, such as Mahmoud Salim al-Awa, a very respectable jurist, al-Bishri, and Mustafa Moro, one of the key activists in the Islamic revival movement, have not offered the Coptic community an ethical niche in which they become open to their grievances, but remain tied to a nationalist imaginary, in which the Copts' place in the nation, or an Islamic state to come, needs serious attention. It tells us how Copts also have responded with plural voices and demanded some form of answerability from their Muslim counterparts. I am merely suggesting how the Coptic community could be allowed the niche to criticize or even to question that notion of Islamic politics of difference. And even when Sabah Mahmoud discusses, it's always a very passing idea of how that the Ottoman model is in mind, is that this is a very different idea of an Islamic politics of difference, in which, you know, there were a few injustices, but it was a very flourishing model of pluralism. And the whole idea is to give the Copts the niche to discuss the power schemas and exclusion suffered by the Coptic community, instead of only reading this Islamic politics of difference in constant analogy to Europe's politics of sameness and assimilation with its Christian roots. In other words, Copts in their plural voices should be allowed to question the Islamic model of difference, since the literature of Islamic revival movements and meta-narratives of the place of how Islam is placed in Egyptian nationalist narratives also always highlights the distinction and some kind of tolerability and pluralism of this particular model. I fear that perhaps in the way that we've discussed Islam in the last few days, has only been seen in analogy to a failing and morally corrupt Christian modernity. And hence, I feel that there's a general tendency to offer Islam as the civilizational antidote to the ills and malaises of Western modernity. Islam becomes only seen through the lens of this relationality. My second point touches upon a certain tendency in the last few days to emphasize how the predicament of Muslims in Europe comes to stand in for the predicament of all Muslims in the world, as well as local non-Muslims living in predominantly Muslim communities. Both Edward Said and Asad and Mahmoud have all examined how Islamophobia is a descendant of anti-Semitism in a different historical context. The threat a minority poses to a given polity may also change over time, writes Sabah Mahmoud in her conclusion. This is evident in how European Jews are treated in Western Europe today in comparison to their situation in the mid-19th century. Once vilified and demonized in anti-Semitic Germany and France, Jews are now recognized as an integral and valued part of Europe's unique Judeo-Christian heritage. In contrast, Muslims who were largely ignored in the mid-20th century Europe are now regarded as a threat to its cultural values and lifestyle. It is the historical legacy of European Jews, that presently affects modern-day Muslims in the West. For the Jews to become fully assimilated as citizens in the time, the Emancipation Project required them to assume certain ways of living. In other words, In as much as emancipation opened windows opportunity for the Jews, they also had to depart from traditional ways of communal life and tune their lives to dictates of modern life. In her autobiographical novel, sorry, my French is a little bit rusty, Rue Ordinée, Rue là-bas, Sarah Kaufman offers an extremely touching testimony about the dark side of assimilation. Her autobiographical novel is precisely about the silky violence of cultural assimilation and the untold story of the destruction of traditional ways of life. Her accounts perhaps gives us a glimpse into similar fears and anxieties of European Muslims in the face of what they see as encroachment of modern life upon their ways of living. Similarly, traditional immigrant Coptic and Salafi family who resided in the West could express similar sentiments. However, I feel that somehow we are still haunted by the notion of being Europe's other, with a capital O, and that we have a tendency to believe that once the problem of the Muslims in the imperial secular center is solved, such resolution will reverberate in a universal kind of emancipation for all Muslims and non-Muslims alike. It reminds us a little of the intellectual tradition that once put European workers and then women, then green materialists as the locomotives of universal emancipation. This is why perhaps I am critical of how Sabah Mahmoud reads those overlapping histories of religious liberty and minority rights, that she takes the local histories of why people appropriate a certain discourse of right or the promise of citizenship as very integral and a moral investment for them, and what kind of horizons do they see in it. And it's not the question of just political secularism between centers and peripheries in very kind of loose lineaments. But actually, she should have, I know that her ethnography focuses on human rights systems and how they create a language of claims for Copts, but we needed to hear Coptic voices. We needed to hear something similar to what happened to the mosque movement. You know, for us to criticize our Western imaginaries or Western preconceptions of freedoms. Perhaps she could have given a niche to criticize their particular grievances. For instance, and as I mean, not to lose the complete thread of thought, but what is almost silent in her ethnography is a certain blame of Islamic revival movements for some of the problems of Copts in a way, and the history of those particular violences, and that it kind of never opened an ethical niche, an ethical thematization, seeds of it to germinate, you know, to recreate a certain different relation with the Copts, but actually it was very more nationalist than nationalist itself sometimes. And you can check the works of Tariq al-Bishri in that sense, or Selim al-Awa for that particular moment, or even the fatwas that pertained, you know, that the fatwas that pertain to the place of Copts in Egyptian societies, sometimes even throughout the network of mosques. I mean, this is the kind of the elephant in the room that sometimes we don't want to speak about. But the whole idea is to how to treat it differently, how to see it through Coptic eyes also. Yes, some of my Coptic interlocutors that I've dealt with, the youth activists, they have, sometimes you might hear the worst of anti-Islamic tropes that you could ever hear. But the whole question is that dealing with them through the lens of anthropological understanding is to know why people think the way they want to think, or what has moved them to borrow sometimes, and I'm not saying that all of them, because as I'm saying, that I'm trying to hear the Coptic community in its plurality. I apologize, I've been going on and on and on. This is my third and last point. My third and last point is based on my belief that the Arab revolutions has perhaps opened the new horizons for political action and its relation to temporality, even though we are passing through the darkest hour of these revolutionary events or their afterlives. So I see on the part of secular forces, you know, that in a way, you can see the catastrophe of national liberation movements ending in certain atrocities against their own peoples. I'm trying to remind you of the extreme hope and the aspirations that were there back in the 60s, what we have now when we face the present and see where national liberation movements have ended and their relations with people in total catastrophe or in genocide. But also, the revolutionary events, despite its failures, also, I believe, that it has, I claim that also some parts of the Islamic current also possessed a secularized eschatological claim on the future. It was only a matter of time. I mean, the whole issue is that back in the 80s, through the Iranian model, there was this emphasis that the revolution, Islamic revolution, was inevitable. The Islamic State to come is just on, the whole idea is that there is this investment that it is inevitable, that it was just on the verge of happening. But I see that the revolutionary events that happened back in 2011, as if all the meta-narratives from the secular forces or a lot of the Islamic forces has kind of withered away. And this is not as if I'm talking in any kind of optimistic note, but actually that it had opened a horizon that it is a burden. In other words, that what are we going to do? What is the ethical and political labor that we should be doing in order for us to remain in a kind of fidelity to the revolutionary events? It opens up a lot of burden on our shoulders. But at the same time, it opens a margin for us to hear the grievances of the Coptic community in a sort of way. I'm talking about the case of Egypt. And how it opens again this question about the future, or even if someone criticizes me that the whole bent of Islamic political theology is more or less originist, or it's a return to the past, but it's a flattening of the past in a sort of way. It's as if it's a very positivistic relation to the past. And it's as if it's the same positivistic relation that the historicists have with the future, as, it's the end, it's just a point towards that we're all marching towards progress. I could say that the same thing with a lot of the Islamic revival movements, that they had the same relation with past crystallized in time in a sort of way. And again, I'm sorry to continue on and on and on, and thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you, Fuad. Our next speaker is Basit Iqbal from the University of California, Berkeley. He's an academic editor and a PhD student in the Department of Anthropology and the program in Critical Theory. His multi-cited dissertation fieldwork explores formation of religious humanitarianism amidst the European refugee crisis, and his publications have appeared in journals such as Method and Theory in the Study of Religion and Anthropological Theory. Please join me in welcoming Basit.
All right, thank you. So, in 1962, the Scottish historian and Harvard Orientalist Sir Hamilton Gibb gave a short address to the American Philosophical Society titled "The Community in Islamic History." Islam shares a lot with Christianity, he began, given their common heritage in the Near East, their monotheism, and more. But Islam also configured itself as a correction of and challenge to Christianity. So this is my gesture at comparative political theology, as Josh invited us. The key word for everything that has to do with Islamic culture is ummah, community. It is in the historical development of this concept and its modalities that the true significance of Islamic history and culture must be sought. And in both of these respects, the two factors of natural genius and conscious distinction from Christianity play decisive roles. Ummah is at once a religious and a social term. It implies totality as opposed to ecclesia. The first political pronouncement of the Prophet Muhammad to the infant Muslim community was, "Ye are one ummah over against mankind," one single society, that is to say, welded together by community of religious purpose and the resulting social relationships and obligations. How to secure, how to maintain that unity became the continuing question for the members of the community and the central theme of its history. So that was a long quote from Gibb, and I'm going to continue glossing him a little bit. So ummah here is something partially articulated in critique of Christianity and the world that it built. Gibb describes in broad strokes how amid theological and juridical differences and political partisanship, what held the community together was not any kind of formal organization, but a collective act of will, inspired by personal conviction and a sense of election, and sustained by ritual duties. But such reliance on an effervescent collective will, instead of the political institutions of Christianity, ultimately led the Muslim to live, and I'm quoting him, to live in a world of symbols where nothing is really what it seems, and words mean something other than what they say. So it has come to the pass that today, in 1962, in the confusions and spiritual distress generated by these intrusive philosophies, men ask whether an Islamic community really exists any longer. Most political observers discount it, but in Islamic matters, it is never wise to rely upon external indices. He concludes that the idea of such community based in common will is still vigorously alive beneath all the historical drastic reconstructions and readjustments that conceal its inner core. All right, so by Gibb's account, contemporary observers have difficulty understanding how this can be. All the more so, I would add, because Ummah does not neatly fit into the territorial order of things familiar to modern social science. The Islamic juridical categories applied to territory did not correspond to a national community or even to the limits of Muslim habitation, instead opposing the abode of war, Darul Harb, to the abode of Islam, Darul Islam. This legal regime was thus both personal and territorial, in that it applied to conduct between Muslims wherever it occurred, and to conduct between anyone if on territory claimed by the Muslim ruler. The further territorialization of Islamic law itself came much later, with some historians dating this achievement as late as the Ottoman integration into the international family of nations. Ruth Marshall once conceptualized political theology at the intersection of sovereignty and community. Yet aside from Gibb's address, almost 60 years ago, academic discussions of Islamic political theology have overwhelmingly emphasized the relationship between Sharia and political sovereignty, whether historically or in the present. Where they do consider Islamic community, they mostly do so with a view to its implications for the nation state. In contrast, this paper and the broader work foregrounds contemporary modalities of the Ummah, and it takes seriously the methodological provocations implicit in Gibb's account. On the one hand, the concept of Ummah is central to the Islamic critique of Christianity, to the former's political theology. On the other hand, one cannot rely on external indices to interpret its efficacy. Political observers, viewing the forms available to them, remain at the level of semblance. Yet, in Islamic history, nothing is what it seems, and even words mean something other than what they say. Gibb is warning that a standard historical account will not do. I would add that such accounts of the Ummah, relying on external indices, remain at the level of what the French linguist Émile Benveniste called the historical plane of enunciation, récit. From the perspective of historical narration, a number of historians and social scientists have argued that the language of Ummah has been thoroughly transformed by the secular grammar of the nation state, so that Ummah has been recoded to align with the modern categories of nation, for example in Tahtawi, or Islamic society, for example Sayyid Qutb. Such arguments suggest that any continued use of the rhetoric of Ummah which ignores these transformations are historically naive. Jamil Aydin, for instance, insists that Ummah is a properly theological term which today only perpetuates the, quote, illusion of geopolitical Muslim unity. Olivier Roy makes a similar argument that the globalization of Islam has deterritorialized the religion so that neo-fundamentalists seek a purified new Ummah. And Faisal Debji finds the idea of a single Muslim Ummah not only disingenuous because it mystifies its politics, but dangerously anti-political because it alienates Muslims from politics, like concrete politics, material politics that they could otherwise engage. In contrast, this paper seeks to begin from what Benveniste called the plane of discursive enunciation, discours, where what is of interest is not the impersonal voice of history, which tracks the transformation of Ummah from the realm of theology to the modern science of secular geopolitics, but a set of relationships between speaker and addressee, convened through the act of enunciation. The historical meaning of such exchanges is more difficult to fix, precisely because it occurs through dialogue, the intersubjective dimension of language, between figures that are equally necessary to the dialogue, and also because the time of the present is consistently disturbed by the discursive enunciation itself, and so cannot be simply stabilized through reference to historical context. This is all like a lengthy methodological prelude to say that I am less interested than in searching for what Gibb called the vigorous inner core of Ummah that perdures through its historical reconstructions, than in following the actual articulations of Ummah, which always occur in dialogue, in argument, and contestation, or in what Talal Asad calls part of a discursive tradition, for which the present is not simply the empty ground for staging a teleological progression from past to future. Rather, Asad insists, in tradition, the present is always at the center, but tradition is not defined by the present. Thus, although the grammar of the nation-state may have conscripted the language of Ummah in our secular age, we must also attend to the way time present is separated from, I'm quoting Asad, separated from but also included within events and epochs, to perceive how agents consciously inhabit different kinds of time simultaneously and try to straddle the gap between experience and expectation. In what follows, then, I start exploring two such dialogues, drawn in part from my fieldwork with Muslim relief workers and refugees in the wake of the Syrian civil war, in order to consider interruption, abandonment, and ruin as modalities of the life of Ummah today. This is one lesson of the work of Sabah Mahmood, whose work is understood in various ways, but she would insist that we attend to the fabric of relationships that endure and incapacitation, and to the political and ethical relations these disclose. All right, so two dialogues. I'm not going to do Noah's thing about like leaning back and forth, but all right, so 15 years ago in Damascus, a friend and I attended a discussion between two Muslims. One was a Syrian professor of Quran recitation and Hanafi jurisprudence. The other was a scholar visiting from the West. The latter had requested the meeting to discuss the status of the juridical terms Darul Harb and Darul Islam, abode of war and abode of peace, or Islam, given that they are not found in the Quran. We met in the former's medical office. He's a doctor who qualified in internal medicine in the West, as well as a professor of Hanafi fiqh and Quran recitation. His scholastic licenses are illustrious, granted from some of the most renowned scholars of the Levant and the Hijaz. The visiting scholar, in contrast, does not have formal training in the Islamic sciences. He worked in Western academia for a time and specializes in Quranic exegesis and Islam-West relations. So the Syrian sheikh apologized for not having had the time to fully prepare a formal response, but he listed a lengthy series of classical scholars, including the eponymous leaders of the Islamic legal schools who employed these terms. The jurist's authority suffices to establish the term's validity for the Ummah today, he said, and quoting, and this is as with any other Islamic term which was defined after the revelation of the Noble Quran. The scholastic terms came later on, but their meaning was already present. Hijrah, exodus, is what differentiates Darul Harb and Darul Islam. And Hijrah, of course, is mentioned many times in the Quran and Sunnah. But the traditional basis of these terms was not what the visiting scholar was after. He clarified, my question was whether their definition has remained fixed. My understanding is that at least one aspect of these terms is to define the relationship between the individual and the state. But the nature of the state now is different. We don't live in a caliphate. And also how the state affects individual lives, that too has changed. The Syrian sheikh was skeptical that modern governmentality affected the status of these juridical terms, while the visiting scholar pointed to the fact that ostensibly Muslim governments were themselves engaged in using bulldozers and helicopters and airplanes to bombard the believers, while those in power were openly pursuing all manner of non-Islamic practices. So, he said, it becomes difficult to define such a place as Darul Islam. Meanwhile, most people already live in a non-Muslim, westernized mental space, relying on economic and technological structures that came from the West. When it is all being materially invaded and reshaped, how much of Darul Islam remains? The Sheikh responded that that there has never existed a perfect Darul Islam, but one's neighbor's interests are one's own, and in the traditional Muslim lands, one still prays over one's neighbors, which simply isn't the case for Muslim minorities living in the non-believing West. He continued, unfortunately, in our time, it's very cloudy because there is no caliph. 100 years ago, even those Muslims who lived as far as India or Morocco were attached to the caliphate. Now, it's more cloudy. But for Muslims reading history, this is the exception, not the usual practice. In the interest of time, I'm not playing out their full conversation here, but suffice it to say that each of these interlocutors was deeply vested in the possibilities of Muslim flourishing under post-colonial conditions of state and market. But they fundamentally differed in how they regarded the contemporary situation, as well as in how to inherit the terms of Islamic legal traditions to which they were both committed. Their conversation symptomatically condensed what Jamil Aydin describes as the major themes of Pan-Islamism, themes which he writes still shape much of transnational Muslim thought, despite their having outlasted Pan-Islamism's originally symbiotic relationship with the British Empire. Among others, these themes include a notion of Islamic civilization, a decline narrative that asks for heroic renewal, a deep historical conflict between Islam and the West, and a new spatial appreciation for the global reach of Muslims and their number. So the Syrian sheikh and the visiting scholar agreed, despite their differences, that the West was at war with Islam, that Muslim societies were collectively weakened but could rise together, and more. But it also demonstrates the complexity of the question. And here I'm following also how Asad writes about the Ummah concept and also about facile analyses of it as a, quote, imagined community along the model of a nation. He says, the crucial point is not that it is imagined, but that what is imagined predicates distinctive modes of being and acting. So paying attention to different kinds of elements of the same conversation, over the course of their exchange, the visiting scholar expanded a perception of governmentality into a critique of globalization. So he's talking about how Dar al-Islam is already invaded by Western consumer goods and material culture, while the Syrian sheikh emphasized an abiding eschatological dimension to the practice of the law, where he says that God will not take people into account if they cannot implement the Sharia divisions of the world into abodes of peace and war. And although their discussion exhibited the symptoms of Pan-Islamism, or what Aydin calls Pan-Islamism, neither of them ignored the historical diversity which historians employ to undermine the idea of a Muslim world. Indeed, it was their affective attachment to the Ummah in all its diversity which accounted for the pain they each felt at perceiving the contemporary condition of the world. So that's the first dialogue. This is the second. A few months ago in Amman, I asked the director of a charitable organization what he makes of the Ummah concept. I will call him Sheikh Uthman. He's the director of the Jama'iyat al-Kitab wa Sunnah, the Association of the Book and Practice, a name which already signals its methodological commitments in Islamic reform. I spent many hours with him over the course of my fieldwork in Jordan, trying to understand how he articulated the mission of Islamic reform with the charitable work the Jama'iyah had become known for. It was originally a cultural organization dedicated to revivalist programs. Scholarship on Salafism in Jordan notes how he led it through a period of rather turbulent politics and sharp observation by the state, where he distinguished its activism for both the jihadi and the quietist wings of Salafism there. But then came the Syrian crisis, and he drastically expanded the scope of his organization toward a humanitarian mission. The organization has recently scaled back its activities due mostly to donor fatigue, which is a common story across all kinds of humanitarian organizations in Jordan, but also here in Lebanon and beyond. But it remains one of the largest Islamic relief organizations in the country. So they pay for cancer treatments and host orphans, they teach Quran and distribute food. I'd asked him about the Ummah in earlier conversations, but this time I specifically mentioned a famous saying of the Prophet that the believers are one body. He, of course, knew the hadith I meant when I mentioned it, and he finished it for me when I mixed up the exact wording at the end. Yes, he said, and there's another hadith about the Ummah. My community is like rain. You know not which of it is best, the first of it or the last of it. But when I asked how he understood the one body part of the hadith, he just laughed a little and said that it's easy to understand in our time of tribulation. The hadith already says what it means. The faithful have mutual concern for one another. But what people don't usually understand, he continued, is how to practice their obligations to each other. Unfortunately, even the Islamic activists, the Islamiyun, don't perceive how their responses to the suffering can be compromised. The hadith describes a situation, but Forms that are available to respond to it have their own corruption built into them. That's my gloss, but he says things like, they don't always respect the dignity of the person they assist. What do you mean? I asked. I'm also thinking of the Quranic verse that says, you, meaning Muslims, are the best community, the best ummah. And he picked up the rest of the verse, the best community drawn forth from people. كُنتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ. Listen, he said, we need to finish reading to the end of the verse. It continues, تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. You enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. Do you know the Egyptian Sheikh al-Sha'rawi? He has one of the subtlest understandings of this verse. He comments that the first phrase is conditional upon the second, so that the meaning is, you will be the best of communities if you enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. It doesn't happen on its own. But then think of the other hadith about ummah. The trial, the fitna of my community is wealth. The destruction of my ummah is in killing one another. And then look around the lands of the Muslims. We have wealth, but are in poverty. We are one ummah, but have sanctified the Sykes-Picot borders and are killing each other. We can't even stop massacres happening 50 kilometers away. I remembered this bitterness a few weeks later when, in summer 2018, the Syrian regime and its Russian allies were bombing the south of Syria, bombarding the province of Dar'a relentlessly, the city that had first erupted with the revolutionary call not to live in fear. A ceasefire of sorts had held for nearly a year, in which local defense forces had set up civil administrations and health clinics. But on June 19th, the regime's methodical campaign to conquer the country, utterly reliant on Russian air power and ground forces and Iranian militias, had reached the southern governorate. Tens of thousands of people fled for the nearest borders, seeking shelter where they could and some kind of surety against the horror raining down from above. Eventually, nearly 100,000 people would reach the border with Jordan, seeking recourse or a safe passage. But the government declared that the border would remain closed, for Jordan was already exhausted and depleted. Social media streams started filling up with maledictions, supplications, imprecations, people realizing to what extent they had been abandoned by the world system, raising their index fingers to heaven, invoking God in appeal or condemnation. Activists within Jordan launched a Twitter campaign and criticized this decision sharply, but the government held firm, saying that it could not and would not admit any more refugees. I had a meeting scheduled with an international relief NGO in Amman that week. Given what news had dominated the headline for days, I expected them to cancel the meeting or to delay it, assuming they would be too busy attending to the aid crisis to meet with a random anthropologist who had cold called them. But instead, they were expecting me when I arrived and ushered me in to have tea with their country director. I asked him my standard questions, about the programs and what motivates their work and, how Islam shapes it or if it does and so on. But then I couldn't help asking what this NGO was doing in response to the 100,000 people hiding in holes and eating leaves to the north. The director was a bit surprised that I asked. Look, he said, we can't do anything for them. They're on the other side of the border, which means that they would fall under the mandate of the Damascus branch of our organization. Of course, the Damascus branch had become basically defunct over the course of the war, and policy literature has clearly established how the Assad regime weaponizes access to humanitarian assistance. If the borders do open, then we'd be able to help them through our emergency services, but until that time, if we could get them aid, it would have to be through the Jordanian military, and that would run counter to our principles. He gestured to 4 glossy posters hanging above the leather sofa he was sitting on: neutrality, independence, universality, and humanity. These are our principles, he said, and they mean that we have to deliver the aid ourselves or go through one of our established partners. The media manager for Jordan operations was sitting in on the meeting. I heard there were some weapons smuggled to the rebels through an aid caravan, she said. Well, there we have it, the director added. And we already know that there are anti-regime militia hiding among the IDPs. So what would happen if they did open the border and terrorists escaped while the civilians were rushing in? Now, at exactly the same time, thousands of individuals across Jordan had started sending aid to the north of the country. Clothes, blankets, umbrellas to protect against the sun, cases of water, bakeries sending trucks of bread, diapers, and medicine, all sent to be piled in heaps in an empty lot in the town of Ramtha. It was once an old square where Turkish pilgrims would rest on their way to Hajj, I was told, as I looked into Syria 1 kilometer away, and it now served as a parking lot. And the aid kept coming, sent by families and small businesses watching the news. Sheikh Uthman, the director of the Salafi charity I mentioned, held a series of meetings with government officials. In the span of a day or two, he had worked out an arrangement with the government in which privately gathered aid, all the stuff at the square, would travel across the border in trucks organized by the Jordanian military. I went to the square where the aid was being gathered and saw him taking a video on his cell phone to send to others far away. On this blessed day, he said, the trucks had been arriving from around Jordan, from Mafraq, from Irbid, from Jarash. This is like the hadith of the Prophet, that no one believes while his neighbor lies hungry. We ask God to relieve the afflicted, to accept our martyrs into paradise, to shield the vulnerable, to reward our Syrian and Jordanian brethren. There is no division among the hearts of the faithful in their mutual mercy. There is no division among the hearts of the faithful in their mutual mercy. The hearts of the faithful extend across these borders where we are standing. Tears sprung to his eyes. This is the meaning of the prophetic hadith about the Muslim community. Ummah, he said, the faithful are one body. When a single limb feels pain, the entire body aches with sleeplessness and fever. So these dialogues, that was two different bits there. So these dialogues depart from the paradigms often invoked to explain contemporary Islamic political theology, whether the robust Pan-Islamism of the early 20th century or the exhausted market democracy of post-Islamism in the late 20th century. Each of these three interlocutors would agree that the Islamic community is not flourishing, that it is absent the form of sovereignty proper to it, meaning at minimum the ability to protect its own integrity. But what is the mode of its current life? Three distinct images appear across these two dialogues. For the Syrian sheikh in Damascus many years ago, the nature of the incapacitation of the ummah takes the form of an interruption. History is like the sea which rushes to the shore and then falls back, he said. There is no caliph at present, but this is the exception for Islamic history, not the norm, and they practice and may yet someday be restored. Meanwhile, God will judge people for how they uphold the law and the practice of it what they can. For the Western Muslim scholar he was talking to, the nature of the incapacitation of the ummah takes the form of abandonment and goes deeper. The post-colonial Muslim governments have betrayed the ummah, abandoning them to the depredations of capital and vice, and meanwhile the religious authorities refuse to reckon with the historical corruption that now shapes every aspect of our exposed lives. For the Jordanian sheikh working in refugee support, finally, we might say that the incapacitation of the ummah takes the form of a ruin in the Benjaminian sense of a history that is both shattered and preserved, whose moments do not simply disappear but remain as ruins. And although he conceives of the Muslim lands spatially, which Aydin had described as a discursive innovation now belonging to the modern science of geopolitics, he does so in the sense of a mortified image that reveals its corruption and pain. The Quran tells us we could be the best community among humankind, he laughed bitterly, if we commanded good and forbade evil. But in their absence, we have neither justice nor flourishing. The forms of action available are ruined, and yet we persist among them. Tahir Zaman comments that instead of conceptualizing ummah at a grand scale, scholars should look for it in the neighborly practices of building Islamic community through mutual aid. As expressed through the work of the Jam'iyyah, for instance, the efficacy of the ummah is hard to deny. Islamic community is here practiced within the space of a world whose terms are largely already defined for it. He talks about the nation states of the Sykes-Picot borders, but the closure of whose grammar is far from complete. More generally, a language of unity suffuses the discourse of contemporary Islam, but its modes of incapacitation are multiple and intensive. And so they don't clearly reflect, the discourse of Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam. These three interlocutors insist that although afflicted by the tribulation of wealth and the devastation of murder, as much as by the imposition of colonial borders and civil war, the faithful have not simply stopped being one body. Rather than community guaranteeing the robust life of tradition, as in McIntyre's narrative account of virtue, interruption, abandonment, and ruin are revealed to be modes of the tradition of Islamic community. I might only be reprising the obscurity and ambiguity with which I began when Gibb was saying nothing is really what it seems, but instead of delving under the semblance to uncover the vigorous inner core of Ummah, I simply suggest that the secret life of Islamic community, such as it is, lies now not in a proper unity of the believers, but in the terms of their dissolution. Thank you.
Yes.
Because it lifts the computer, I can read better.
Okay. Our last speaker is Professor Lama Abu Audi, who's currently Altaf al-Sabbah Visiting Chair in Women and Societal Development Studies. She is Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law Center, specializing in Islamic family law, comparative criminal law, feminist jurisprudence, and queer legal theory. She has written extensively on this topic, in addition to more wide-ranging topic and in the discipline of Middle Eastern studies. Of relevance to today's talk is her review of Sabas Mahmoud book, from which I think the talk would draw upon post-secularism and the woman question. Please join me in welcoming our last speaker, Lama Abu Audi.
So thank you all for being here and for sticking it out. This is going to be short, and I really look forward to the Q&A. The title of my talk is Post-Secularism and the Woman Question. I will discuss the woman question in post-secularism by offering my critique of Sabah Mahmoud's book, Politics of Piety, the Islamic Revival, and the Feminist Subject. But before I do so, let me just state that I am a legal academic and I am not a reader of the field of anthropology. I am unfamiliar with the theoretic jargon of the discipline, and I don't mean, by using the word jargon, I don't mean disrespectfully. I'm a lawyer, and law also has its own jargon, which I use all the time. Even less so of the jargon of the subfield Anthropology of Religion, from which politics of piety hails. Each discipline is autonomous, more so fields of study within each discipline. Those fields usually coalesce around a celebrity figure of a theorist who originates a theoretic language that his or her mentees use to signal their affiliation with the field. Critique of the celebrity figures of the field usually occurs by way of addition, modification, complexification, and rarely in the form of radical critique. Radical critique is usually costly for those affiliated with the field because of the way academia is organized. One needs the reference letter, the invitation to a conference, and the book review. This is all to say that politics of piety may have already been subject to a great deal of critique by way of addition, modification, complexification. Sadly, being an outsider and missing the subtleties of the exchange between mentors and mentees within the field of anthropology of religion, I am unaware of any of it. Now, the book Politics of Piety was published in 2005 and has had a great and successful career in Euro-American academia. One sees it cited everywhere, and I mean everywhere, typically in the context of denouncing Western feminism. Sometimes one sees the word secular inserted between Western and feminism, or in asserting a counter and different kind of feminism to the Western one. The book, which anthropologizes the piety movement among women in the 90s of the 20th century, namely the women of the mosque in Egypt, has never been translated to Arabic. I find that to be a fascinating fact. It has been more than a decade since its publication and has had a huge informative effect on a whole generation of academics in Euro-American academia, especially among a whole generation of academics in Euro-American academia, especially among those interested in the study of Islam and Muslims. My page flips very quickly, but it has had a bare life in the Arab world. It appears that a book that talks about an Arab phenomena has caused an explosion in the West, but has landed a dud in the Arab world. The question is why? I'll try to present now. I don't know. For all I know, someone is translating it right now, and it'll be published tomorrow. I have no idea. I did make an attempt. I called a few people when I decided to do this presentation. I called a few people who I know in Egypt who are interested in these issues, feminist friends of mine, to ask, do you have any idea why a book that was published in 2005 about women in Egypt that has had such an unbelievably formative effect in academia abroad. Why it has never been published in Arabic, no one knew. One friend shot back, لأنه عبط, she said, because it's idiocy. And understandably, she felt antagonized by Mahmoud's book, which itself is deeply antagonistic to what she does, and she is a secular feminist. I mean, the whole book is an assault on secular feminists in Egypt, and my friend gave her the compliment back by calling her book idiocy. It may have been that the book fell right between the secular feminist activists, or just not interested in it, and the religious intelligentsia in Egypt may just not be interested in things that have to do with women, or maybe in Salafi women. I don't know. I find that to be a fascinating subject, especially that Mahmoud's later book on the Copts has already been translated. But this book has been around for so long and doesn't seem to have been translated, nor has it triggered any debate that I am aware of. It hasn't in any public debate that I am aware of. Okay, so I will try to present my critique of the book without falling into the trap that Saba Mahmoud, its author, laid out for the critic of her thesis. In the book, Saba Mahmoud used the case of the Egyptian pious women of the mosque with whom she had repeated ethnic encounters in the 90s to critique the secular/liberal/feminist assumptions that undergird the critique of the Muslim revivalist movements in general and the female piety movement in particular. I call it a trap because anything you say by way of critique can be returned back to you by the author of the book as a form of secular/liberal/feminist bias. For it is Saba Mahmoud's project in the book to show to show that the piety movement is an instantiation of a completely different epistemological grid from that of its critics that can only be comprehended, she asserts over and over again, on its own terms. To critique the movement by using terms from a counter-epistemological grid, such as secularism/liberalism/feminism, is to be already guilty of misrecognition. To say, for instance, that the women of piety are submissive to patriarchal authority is to be already wedded to the epistemological grid of secular feminist liberalism, and your critique instantly fails, or rather slides unnoticed along the scaffolding of these pious women's own way of knowing the world. At best, you are ignored, unheard, and seen, and at worst, you exemplify in your critique an error of judgment that is motivated by your own epistemological spectacles. The problem, put simply, is that you used your terms to understand theirs, and the goal is to get you to shed your bias by unknowing what you know in order for you to know what you need to know. To avoid that trap, I will instead try to show the internal incoherence of the argument made in the book. This actually goes back to my own training as a critical lawyer. One of the first inductions I received as a crit was from my mentor was, you need to show the internal coherence of the argument, not just that the representation doesn't match the facts as you see them. And this is what I will try to do in this short presentation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me first describe in my own words what the book is about. According to Saba Mahmoud, the women who joined the piety movement she studied saw themselves as rebelling against, as they put it, the increasing westernization and secularization of Egyptian culture. The lessons they received from the da'ya is the woman who teaches them, in the mosque was the medium through which they learned to replace this knowledge piece by piece, the Western and secular knowledge, replace it with an alternative Islamic one. In short, the lessons help these women to know the world, or rather to re-know it, their own private one that also included their men, and the public one Islamically. The lessons took place in a particular mosque, sometimes in both upper class and working class neighborhoods, and included the lessons, that is, jurisprudential discussions that covered topics that were of interest to the women attending those lessons. Those topics included the proper way to dress, the proper way to be in male company at the university or the workplace, how to deal with an unpious husband, and whether to attend an establishment that served alcohol. When the lesson ended, prayers were held, often led by the da'iyah herself. Those lessons took place several times a week, and women who attended them often found themselves in conflict with husbands or family who were disapproving of the transformation affected on these women and their bodies through the regular attendance of these lessons. Despite opposition, those women persisted, and how to resist family pressure became one of the regular topics raised in those lessons. In the book, Saba Mahmoud proposes that we understand the piety movement as a discourse of ethics that produces its own subjects. More so, it is a discourse that produces the very body that performs its dictates. Through repeated performances of the dictates of this discourse, the body is produced over and over again. By way of example of piety's ethical discourse, Mahmoud describes two different ethical registers women are advised to use to resist adversity. One is the moral high ground, and the other is sabr, patience. Make the husband feel guilty, and if that doesn't work, be patient. If we take the veil that the women of the mosque donned as an expression of their membership in the movement, Saba Mahmoud proposes that it would amount to nonsense to say, by way of feminist critique, something like, the veil restricts the movement of these women. That sentence would be one plucked out of a secular liberal feminist text in which the veiled subject precedes the discourse of the veil, and in which agency to move as one wishes is considered a precious right. To say that would be to understand it backwards, according to Mahmoud. Rather than the veil restricts the movement of these women, it is that the veil produces the woman or the body for whom restriction of movement is a pious goal. And if one were hung up on agency, what agency there is an agency to submit. Welcome to the world of social conservatism, and she uses the word to describe these women as the word of social conservatives. She seems to say it has its own internal logic, which you need to understand if you want to have any influence on it. What is interesting about Saba Mahmoud's theory is that in its attempt to represent the piety movement as performative ethics, it does so on the terms of this movement own idealistic terms. It reproduces the movement in theoretical terms ideally. There's no hint of critique, no sign of interest in noting failure of performance for the purpose of undoing the discourse of the piety movement. To the contrary, Mahmoud posits that failure of performance can be remedied by these pious women through more performances to master the ethics the discourse promotes. This Mahmoud insists on to distinguish her reading of the piety movement as discourse from the reading of her mentor, Judith Butler, of heteronormativity as discourse. while Butler also argues that heteronormativity produces its own subjects by creating a necessary link between sex, gender, and desire, she nevertheless, driven by the desire to undo heteronormativity, looks for failure of performance to signal the locus of this undoing. But Mahmoud entertains no such desire when it comes to the piety movement. Her theoretic framing, rather than offering critique for the purpose of undoing, offers flattery. The discourse of piety is capable of producing perfect subject, Mahmoud asserts. No failure of performance is referred to by the theorist to show the discourse's will to power. Accordingly, Safa Mahmoud's refrain to feminists, like myself, who might be tempted to do just that, is to say either A, if you want to intervene in the discourse of piety, you have to do it on this discourse's own terms, or alternatively, B, and there she tightens the screws on the feminist critique, the discourse of piety is so productive of its subject that it becomes coded into the body. To undo it, you have, to use her word, retune the body itself. Now, that's no easy task. But turning a discourse theoretically into an epistemological closure, which is what, in effect, she does. The piety movement's discourse is so epistemologically closed, you can only intervene by using its own terms. It's so embodied, right? To intervene from the outside is close to impossible. I mean, that's the theory. Making intervention in it conditional on the discourse's own term is to make intervention impossible. It is as if Sabah Mahmoud wants to say these women were tone deaf to feminist discourse. A theoretic work that endows on its object discourse a closure so perfect that makes any serious change impossible is theoretic work that matches its object perfectly. But on the other side, interestingly, Sabah Mahmoud makes secularist discourse porous and open to change. After all, that's precisely what the women of piety were doing, and quite successfully, apparently. They used to be non-religious and became so. They used to be non-veiled and became so. By making secularism porous and open to change against the grain of her claim that secularism and piety form two opposing epistemological grids, she signals her approval of the shift in these women's lives. The pious is close to the secularist agenda of change, but the secularist is open to the pious agenda of change. And this is where I think Sabah Mahmoud's thesis is internally incoherent, because she asserts that they are close to each other, but you read on and it's just apparent that you can travel from secularism to piety, and she totally approves of that, but the reverse travel from piety back to secularism, that's no, you can't do that, no, it's closed, you have to talk their language. If I am right, and Sabah Mahmoud does more in theory than represent the movement, but slides into complete identification with it so that she comes close to becoming its spokesperson, the question is why. The background thesis behind the study of women of piety is the claim that Western secular liberal discourses have reshaped the Muslim world, and that is bad. And that is the background thesis of Sabah Mahmoud's book. Like, you get to the end, she gives you this whole thing about how the Muslim world has just basically been transformed by Western secular discourses, and the revivalist movements are trying to undo that. Something precious, Islam Muslim, was lost and had to be changed. This background claim, diagnosis, assessment corresponds with the claim of the women in the piety movement, who see Westernization, as I said earlier, and secularization all around them, and who seek to undo it. The trade-off that Sabah Mahmoud's theorization engages in, trading off a feminist agenda for a socially conservative one, because of the latter's Islamic revivalist effect, sacrificing women in order to salvage a lost authentic Islam, is a project in the heart of identity politics. Sabah Mahmood denies that is what the women are doing and insists that the Women of Piety's project is one of ethics, not identity, but this can be true without denying the identitarian terms on which the project of ethics is constituted. Muslim identity is simply reconstituted on ethical terms. A theoretic exercise that begins with proposing two mutually epistemological closures, but once carried out in effect closes off feminist secular intervention by endowing the piety movement with closure, is a theoretic exercise that merges with the claim of the Islamic revival. This, of course, begs the question, if the liberal secular is open to Islamist intervention, why not the Islamist one? Specifically, as it relates to the women of piety, if they were unveiled before they were veiled, why can't they be unveiled again? If they were non-pious before they became pious, why not unpious again? And one of my friends told me, actually, a woman called Sana, who was one of the women with whom Sabah had ethnic encounters, already unveiled. She's already quit the movement. The question, and put in Sabah Mahmood's own terms now, is why take Islamic revivalist movement as an authentic representation of a lost Islam when the thesis that Islam is lost is itself a claim of the revivalist movement? And why is there a trade-off of women to secure Islam as identity? Academic feminism emerging from the Middle East studies complex is here in Sabah Mahmood pushed to the breaking point. Those who write within this complex have often insisted that modernity has witnessed several attempts by Muslim women to engage their own religion feministically. To do so, they sought to liberalize the hierarchical relationships of gender they were born into by appealing to concepts of justice and equality in the Quran against the grain of jurisprudential wisdom that asserted otherwise and that were articulated in positive family laws throughout the Arab world in the 20th century. If we were to follow Sabah Mahmood's theoretical formulation to its logical end, these attempts are either impossible or undesirable. Impossible because of conservative social mores are autonomous unto themselves, can only be changed on their own terms. Undesirable because of the problem of inserting secularity into religious discourse, which would be frowned upon on revivalist terms. And here we get to what I would call the Joseph Massad problematic. Asserting an authentic Islam that was despoiled by the West, that polices any attempt at inserting rights, gay rights for instance, as Euro-normative intervention. Each gesture of liberality is denounced as inauthentic, which then turns the Euro-American academic into the self-appointed policeman, policewoman of feminist and gay activism in the Arab world. Thank you.
Thank you, Lama. We have around 40 minutes left for Q&A, so I open the floor for question, comment. Yes. Can you use the mic, please?
Sorry, Fouad, I have a question for you. I'm trying to track the what the local is doing for you, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, because I'm sort of taken by this anthropological sense that what we do in some ways is a local history of concepts, and that's what you wanted. That's what you wanted to do, and that's what you wanted Sabah Mahmood to do, to sort of tell a local history of concepts that tells you something else about Copts' investment in political citizenship. And I guess I was curious about whether you mean a local history of concepts or or attention to the local context in the mobilization of these circulating concepts, which seems to me those seem to be different projects in some ways. And so if it's the former, I guess, could you say a little bit about the local history of the concepts that are circulate? I mean, right, so that was your sort of critique, is that there's no attention to the local history of these concepts. Could you say a little bit more about, do you mean like a genealogical local history or something else? And I guess the reason I'm asking is because I get wary of the anthropological tendency to focus entirely on the local, as if the local doesn't itself have connections to the non-local or the global, right? And like Michel Rolfe-Triot has this kind of interesting distinction between what he calls locale, locality, and localization. And he makes the argument that anthropologists for too long have focused on the locale or locality that ostensibly has no history. And that what, unfortunately what anthropologists have done in the past is kind of treat the local as if it's some sort of closed entity. And what he wants is that we attend to what he calls localization and the imbrication of the so-called local in these global processes. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about how you would tell the story of the local history of the concepts that Copts are using to think through this question of political citizenship.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Thing is actually, I think in much more simpler terms than that, is that I was thinking that there is a lot of emphasis on the concepts in practice in a sort of way. And in many ways, the way that she wants to describe the interconnections between, like, kind of what I call center and periphery, to connect them in order to serve into a kind of a narrative of political secularism, in a way, it somehow, at the very end, it becomes all of a sudden a contention with human rights systems. It becomes a contention with more or less, what do you call it, political secularism. But the whole issue is that I, as a local, I mean, the question is always also of audience, like what kind of address, who am I addressing myself? What is my own predicament in a sort of way, and what kind of audience that I want to tell? The problem is that I feel at the very end that she did not capture certain textures of the predicament itself, that in certain ways could not flatten, I mean, or offer a very different ways of thinking differently about political secularism, or why some Coptic activists and even men of religion that believe in the promise of citizenship, and sometimes that there are tropes or the ways that people they invoke it. It's not only in the language of rights. It's not, I mean, I understand that actually Talal Asad is talking that we have to notice that the secular and the religious are so intertwined that sometimes, yes, actually the secular category actually does precede our notion of religion. But the whole idea is to go further. So, for instance, I like to speak in examples. Again, I speak in. That's what I'm asking for, actually. If you could tell in simpler terms, more about how you would is that the whole idea is that when I was talking about the certain quarrel that Pope Shenouda had with Anwar al-Sadat over the law of introducing Sharia in Egypt, and he was contending with him. It's not the question that it was just the invocation of a certain language of rights. When he was speaking in a particular tone to the president, he was talking about a certain covenant, a certain promise, is that let us remember together what happened in the Egyptian nationalist movement of spilling blood together, or that what does a promise or a covenant mean in a sort of way. And in that sense, when you talk to the president in a sort of way, it depends on the address. And in that sense, how Sadat responded to him is that he thought it was pride. He responded with a lot of animosity. And in that sense, it's very interesting to talk about those local, I didn't mean it in that sense, but a textured argumentation of why they see citizenship as a promise, why certain grievances that they want to talk about, sometimes they would horribly sometimes use Islamophobic content. The whole idea is to understand, you are right, to understand the local context that allows people to speak in a sort of way and to hear them. You know, like the whole idea, if you've done that with the mosque movement to a sort of sense, in order to shift our understanding of agency and the secular preconditions, you could do a very different job with the Copts. And this is what I'm trying. Maybe I am in fidelity to Saba Mahmoud and Talal Azad more than they can imagine. But the whole idea is to undo also that kind of blind belief in the Islamic politics of difference that's always highlighted against the failures of Christian modernity. A Copt would bring a very muddled story. He would stop that kind of, and again, to continue, I mean to quicken up. The whole idea is that also if there is this problematization of mourning for secular futures, you know, what is expected of Muslims in Europe, that they should, it's not that the question it's at, you know, when David Scott is dealing with Talal Asad saying that he has a tragic sensibility, you know, that there is something about the failure of the modern project itself as if it is, Muslims in the West are playing a sort of role to reconcile or to show that kind of distance between the goal or the purpose and what has been achieved and what has failed in modernity in a sort of way. He doesn't want Muslims to play that role. For me, in a sort of way, I don't want Copts to play that role for either the nationalist discourse or sometimes the Islamic leaning discourse, which actually have a very nationalist discourse when it comes to the Copt that he must assimilate in a sort of way. And that there is, I see that there is very little of the space of ethical thematization that Assad and Saba Mahmoud want to envision, but I don't find it there. Sorry, no.
We have a question here.
Not mine.
Can you just wait for the mic?
Thank you for the lovely panel. My question is for Dr. Lama. So you had, in the beginning, mentioned a very interesting question about why the book has not been translated. And I was wondering maybe one of the reasons might just be how Saba Mahmood in the introduction of the book says that she's primarily writing for a Western audience using their terms, conditions, and premises, and not necessarily writing for the people she is planning to work with. One of my critiques of the book is actually that it's called Politics of Piety, but there's very little definition of the word piety itself or what being pious means. That's at least how, but I think that is in some ways working. It's also the point that she's trying to prove that there's a certain sense of interiority to it that just cannot be captured by going there, because she writes that she's coming from a South Asian progressive left background in Pakistan, and therefore it does have a particular influence on her going to Egypt in a different context and studying these women. So I was wondering, one, do you have a definition of piety with which you read that book? Because she obviously doesn't provide, and I think in the next year, the book, Lara Deeb's book, which comes, and they're in some ways in conversations with each other, Lara Deeb does provide a definition of piety, but pretty much in the concluding chapters or in the conclusion. And I was wondering if you think there can be a critique of piety from these women themselves, or critique then, as in other works of Saba Mahmood comes, it's pretty much a work of secular sensibilities. So I understand the presentation you were trying to make, but just to sort of turn the tables, in case, do you see that, because as I understand the book, and I might be completely wrong, I'll have to reread it many times, I guess, that she was not saying that these women are sort of defending patriarchy. I think at some point she says that she reads it as a patriarchal sort of a setup, but she was perhaps trying to locate agency in that. So I was wondering if the relationship you see between piety and critique in that particular book, or do you think that the meaning of critique, as broadly as one wishes to define it, is completely absent from that project?
Oh, okay. So you said many things there.
Okay, so I mean,
It's
just
a very long question.
it was more of a, okay, yeah, fine, but just really, do you see any kind of relationship between piety and critique there? Because, or you think this critique is just absent from that? in her reading.
That was my thesis, right? That she describes, I have to tell you, like, I have a bit of a personal stake in the Women of Piety thing because in 1985, as I always jokingly say, we lost cousin Lena to the piety movement. I used to have a cousin and she joined this movement in Amman, the equivalent of it, and I literally haven't seen her since, even though she lives in a house that separates us with a fence. And she's decided that she doesn't want to cross that fence because the house where I grew up is too secular. All right? So that's piety for you, right? So, and I said, that's piety for you, okay? So what's my definition of piety? I don't know. I can tell you the life of my cousin. I'm not an anthropologist, and I'm just reading what she's relaying to me through staging these encounters with these women. This has been ongoing basically in also Syria. The Qabisiyat have led that movement. In Jordan, it's Fadia Tabba. I don't know the equivalent. I think there are Qabisiyat here as well in Lebanon. I understand the format. I know quite a bit about these people because I've known them personally. I don't know them as anthropological subjects that I go study for 3 months and then go to Berkeley and write my dissertation about. That's not how I know them. But at the same time, this movement has lost, I mean, it was incredibly powerful in the 80s and the 90s, but it has lost its impact. Like the idea that people her theoretical representatives, they walk in and then closure, you can't talk to them unless they've trickled out and they've loosened with the age, they've loosened out and they've incorporated all kinds of things. It's only Sabah Mahmoud herself, because of her own sort of, as I was saying, complete identification with the movement, that she almost turns into the spokesperson for them, that she produces a theory that describes them as perfecting the discourse. And if there's a failure of discourse, they just have to do it again, and then they're just going to match the ideal of the discourse. I say that representation is not critique at all. It's that she's not interested in critiquing them. She's only interested in critiquing secularist approaches to them. But I can easily do exactly what she has done and produce a very critical discourse that uses the whole sort of Foucauldian, Judith Butlerian sort of the body produced by the discourse and all of that, all of it. I can do that while still showing that it was a discourse of will to power and that these women that were submitting to patriarchal authority, et cetera, and that there is a possibility for feminist critique. I could just do it differently. But that's not what she's interested in, right? She wants to make it look like what she saw impels her to say it's an epistemological closure, and I just don't buy it. It's just not possible.
We have a question here.
So thank you very much for the panel. I'm not sure I'm breaking every rule. You know, you're not supposed to just make a statement and say respond. But I'm sort of curious about the comment at the end about the epistemic closure on the one hand, with both Bassett's paper and Fuad's, which seem to indicate sort of a multiplicity of ways of thinking about whether it's the Ummah, relief and development, Islam, or the Coptic question. And just thinking, and again, I'm not an anthropologist, and these are just sort of stray observations in the same way that you were saying, to think about various Coptic responses that I've been witness to or engaged with over the last 2 years to various attacks. So thinking, for instance, of the bombing in Abbasiyya, where a number of Copts end up reciting outside of the funeral that they're not let into. Maybe it's even their family member because Sisi's taken it over. And they start reciting the Nicene Creed in Arabic. How do you interpret this in relationship to this melding of religion and politics, and the fact that that very same person may also have put up one of the flags that always litter Cairo after these attacks, with the sheikh and the priest hand in hand with Egypt? And that same person may also make appeals to rights, right? That they're invoking all of these in the same way that I think, Bassett, you're sort of suggesting the Ummah, and while you theorized it with these different groups, I suspect, I don't know Jordan as well as Egypt, that sometimes those groups or they cross and bleed, and one moment are this. And so it's not as epistemically closed. And so I was just wondering if you could talk to each other about the possibility that these sort of, the way in which individuals or groups may appeal at the very same moment to language of rights, language of the citizenship and the nation, even as they also invoke theological claims about the Nicene Creed. I read that movement of the Nicene Creed. It wasn't about the Nicene Creed. It was about saying, we're publicly saying, we are here and this is ours. It was an act of political theology, in the same way that I see what you're saying about the Ummah. I don't know if that's a question or as a comment to say, how do you think about these sort of movements and multiplicities that you're suggesting, I think especially Bassett, how it might crack open what was suggested to be an epistemic closure. Does that make some sense? If not, just ignore me.
All right, I'll take a first stab at this. I guess I don't see either what I'm looking at either kind of ethnographically what I'm looking at, or in reading Politics of Piety. I don't see epistemological closure there at all. I see an effort at trying to understand certain forms of life which are not closed off from other forms of life, right? These aren't bubbles that are internally homogeneous, but there is a certain grammar that unites, that articulates certain kinds of practices, and what unites them is a shared project, right? And so, as a grammar that articulates these practices, the coherence that's gained through attempting to practice this kind of, or to inhabit a form of life, is achieved not through staging a kind of homogeneity or epistemological closure, but in kind of maintaining a certain temporal coherence, right? So attempting to implement a certain project through the performance of certain virtues that might or might not be felicitous, right? Of course, they're not going to, that perfection is not something that is necessarily achievable, but it's held together by this kind of temporal project. So there's that on the one hand, and then in thinking about the multiplicity of the Ummah, of course, all these different groups are kind of talking to each other and also being ignored, and some of the international organizations have no use for the local Islamic organizations, right? They think they're parochial, they think they're possibly dangerous, they confuse categories of proper secular aid and the curation of souls or something as well, right? And there's efforts to talk to each other, right? And there's efforts to break open or to encounter the ways in which these forms of life are already exposed to each other, right? So it's not that a form of life is a closed bubble, but that it's a temporal project that already inhabits a shared world. And so it's a matter of picking up on the places at which these shared forms of life already touch. So that's maybe like a beginning of a response.
I have nothing to say.
Thank you for your question. I'm not sure how to respond actually, but you're right when it comes to, the question that definitely there is more or less a moral investment in the promise of citizenship in a sort of way. But also you have a very disastrous effect that took place after 2004 and 13, where the whole idea is that you are trying to appeal to a sort of national body. You're asking people to corporatize in a sort of way against a certain sect, that as if we need to exercise the Muslim Brotherhood out of the national body, and they are becoming the enemy. And in that sense, I became a certain, it's a birth of a new national contract that takes place over whatever has happened after 2013 with the massacre and whatever. And in that sense, it becomes this whole idea of also the failures of, or the dark side actually of those appeals to national belonging, for instance. But the whole issue also is that I was always emphasizing the Copts as plural voices, that in certain ways, definitely the Pope, the new Pope, Tawadros, did actually pose with Sisi during that time, but it was always alongside Sheikh al-Azhar in a sort of way, in order for the right, the national right to complete, to be completed, to be christened, so that the kind of an exorcism or a setting apart or a sabotage of a certain sect, the Muslim Brotherhood becomes a sect that needs to be exorcised out of the national body. But the whole idea, for the very first time, look at the relation between Copts and the church at this particular moment. This is not Pope Shenouda with his political charisma and his ability to completely engulf everyone within the church as a kind of a alternative body that gives Copts their identity. Pope Tawadros, it's kind of more difficult. Concerning the question of I'm not sure if I'm responding in that particular sense, but the whole idea of the forms of life is that sometimes, yes, definitely it is shared, or it becomes like it's not a bubble or a closed bubble. But for instance, when I talk to a lot of Copts about how they perceive the transformations of their neighbors and neighborly relations, people whom they knew on a certain, shared a certain life with certain social and ethical mores that they kind of shared. And the way that they felt after the certain transformation in the 1970s with the rise of the Islamic revival movement. Definitely, there is still a shared space, but for the Copt, it became a space of caution, more or less, like seeing the neighbor change in a sort of way, and because of a new acquired sort of religiosity in a sort of way, sometimes it breached a certain social relation. It mended it on other terms, but they felt it as a kind of a breach. And how will they infer that? Is it because he became, quote unquote, more religious, that I have become all of a sudden, that I've become marked in a sort of way as a Copt? Or actually that it's just a new way of approaching him and to put some sort of a shared life world with a sort of way. But in many ways, some Copts have talked about being marked after the changes in those religious, in their worlds, because of the transformations that happened to their neighbors, for instance, and how they became marked in a sort of way. I'm not sure if I answered completely.
I really didn't understand the question.
What I was suggesting is you were reading Mahmoud as putting an epistemic closure. And I was reading Bassett as saying these forms of life also have a variety, and also Fuad is suggesting, especially in his question back, that even as he's being critical of Mahmoud and Assad to some sense, that he also wants to take seriously some of the things that they're noting, and he's commenting on the multiple ways that various Copts as well as local histories might engage with this. And I was suggesting, same way you're saying, having lived in Egypt, been in Egypt both during the Palm Sunday attacks and during the attack on Al-Qadisiyah, and seeing the ways that Copts responded in multiple ways, even often the same Copt. And if you had just read the moment where they're outside chanting the Nicene Creed against their own Pope and against Sisi, you could read it in the Politics of Piety. But there's also that same person who may appeal to citizenship, or also might have a picture of Sisi and think he's the greatest thing that's ever happened to them. And yeah, sorry. And so I'm just saying, it would seem that both Fuad and Bassett's work seems to be suggesting, as you admitted that you don't read this or engage with this, that there is a possibility of sort of epistemic openness and attentiveness in Mahmoud's project that is being carried on both in someone who, I don't want to speak for either of you, a student of hers, and someone who is appreciative but also ultimately critical. And I was just wondering if you might reflect on that, or am I totally misreading this?
Well, I think it's very important for her thesis on the women of piety to insist on epistemological closure of the piety movement, because I think that she comes from the position that there are women who are socially conservative, and feminism has to contend with that, and that the discourse of feminism just cannot break the solidity of social conservatism. And if you want to make a point, you really have to do it on their own terms, although she never explains what those own terms are. I happen to have written a whole article, 100 pages, discussing the differences between the Islamic jurisprudential schools on any given matter relating to women. And so if what she means is it has to be within their own terms, is exactly what these women were doing in the mosque, which is saying jurist so-and-so said so-and-so and so said so, and take this. If that's what we mean, that we have to confine ourselves to the space among these jurists, where I can tell you from now, that's a very limited space. I mean, there are differences between them, but when it comes to women, it's quite limited, right? And so what it is confining one to some kind of a sort of a moderate form of Islamic feminism. And I'm always happy to encounter Islamic feminism, that's great. But I see my position as pushing from outside. And I read the push from outside as always have been extremely important for the transformation on the inside. In fact, I think the more you loosen outside intervention, the more the social conservatives win. So there has to be pressure coming from the outside, and I think that these discourses are very porous, and people enter and leave discourses all the time. So the idea that it's porous and you have to do it on their own terms just... and going back to the question of why it has not been translated to Arabic, I think I find that actually really an interesting question, because I've just read a book by Afia Zia. It was a Pakistani. I don't know if she's an anthropologist even. She's probably is, and she's talking about the enormous influence Sabah Mahmoud's book on politics of piety, on what's going on in Pakistan. Apparently, it's been so influential that even people who who work on giving aid to NGOs working on women, I mean like Western aid organizations or Western funders of NGOs working on women, have been deeply influenced by the idea that the only way you can promote women's rights is on their own terms. And she wrote a whole book criticizing that and saying that the effects of it has been to really keep women under the grip of clerical authority in Pakistan, that they never really exited. So it just raises the question, why hasn't that been a thing in Egypt? Why isn't it funders of women's organizations have not picked up on that? After all, she's discussing women in Egypt, but it seems to have traveled to Pakistan without really traveling to Egypt, and it's got to be because she's Pakistani, I suppose. So, and it's not about that I'm only talking to a Western audience, right? Because its impact has been felt in Pakistan. But who knows how these things travel? I have no idea.
We had a question in the back.
Okay, so my question is for Bassett. I just wanted, so I was struck, I don't know if this is where you're going, basically I'm just going to push you to talk a little bit more about what you spoke about. I was struck by the difference between the kinds of moral imperatives that we saw at the NGO site with literally the principles on the wall. And I don't know if this was the intention of your comparison, but I can't help but thinking about, you know, what Asad talked about, which I think he was right, which is the Kantian paradigm of the moral imperative. And then we're trying, and then so I took the comparison to be trying to draw something else out, which Asad also speaks about, you know, this, a kind of ethical life that's lived, not with this bracket between the principle and the subject. So I wanted to see if that was where you were going with it, and if that is where you're going with it, if you could tease out more what the latter is. And then my second part of the question, if you want to go this far with me, is to think more about what kinds of failure look like within those different paradigms. So just, you know, stipulate what I'm saying. Asad says that failure within the Kantian paradigm ultimately comes from the fact that the subject can't ground itself, and so the moral imperative always produces a certain kind of contradiction. And then you're also gesturing to failure, but because you're dealing, I take it to be in a different space of ethics, or of what exactly is failure there, if there is failure. That's, yeah.
Thank you. So this wasn't something I was explicitly drawing out, but thank you for pointing this out. So one thing that I began by pointing out how, you know, some historians and social scientists have approached the Ummah, right, as you know, that you know, today is you know, serves as a term that's an illusion, right, for Muslim unity. It doesn't actually exist, right? And so this is the discourse, right, the ideology that kind of is on the surface, and underneath there are actual historical material realities, including the institutions of the nation state and so on. And so I was saying that I was departing from that, but kind of the broader structure of that argument, which is shared across, I think, much social science and much history, is that you know, in the past, historically, before colonialism or something like that, the Ummah was operative because it was mediated through traditional forms of, I don't know, communal organization. And it was, you know, it was one term, and then there were other terms that were associated with it. So you understood yourself as part of the Ummah, you know, through also your location as part of a tribe or, you know, empire. And so there's different scales that are involved, and the Ummah is one part of that broader scale. So it was always mediated. And then now, after the in a post-colonial condition, after the Islamic revival, after all these things, now it's become objectified and explicit, and it's immediate. And so this is like a new phase. And so there's this opposition between kind of historical mediation and modern objectified, immediate, kind of explicit thematization of the Ummah. And so that's kind of the narrative that's implicit in much of this social science and history. And I'm kind of setting that aside and just trying to focus on different ways it's used. And so that's what like the ruin, interruption, abandonment was doing. And so what you end up pointing out, kind of because these principles of neutrality and independence and so on at this humanitarian office that are literally on the wall, and these are the principles that are keeping these people, you know, from actually organizing, you know, their organization with its infrastructure, with its ability to, you know, to organize aid and so on. It's the principles that are explicit and objectified and so on the wall that are keeping them from this kind of action. So this isn't a response to your question. I'm basically pointing out how this contrast that you're emphasizing between like an ethical ground on the one hand and like an explicit Kantian paradigm on the other. It's present at different scales in the paper, but I'm not yet sure where to go with it. So that's one thing. In terms of failure, I'm thematizing these three things, like ruin, abandonment, and interruption, as three modes. I say incapacitation, with kind of this implicit sense that often tradition in the anthropology of religion specifically is understood as the teaching of of capacities or the developing of capacity for perceiving certain things or at the expense of others, or performing certain actions or not others. And I'm suggesting that we also pay attention to different modes of incapacitation, which might be failure of a certain type, but it also resonates, I think, with something Benjamin talks about when he's talking about allegory, and that he wants to understand how he wants to understand a world that is meaningful in the stations of its decay, right? So it's not just simple, kind of in the positivist or historicist sense, like either there is something there or there is not. There's modes of incapacitation or different varieties of incapacitation that have their own poetics, and so that's what I'm interested in looking at.
Thank you. So, Lama, since you explicitly identified your sympathies with legal advocacy, emancipation for minorities within Muslim societies, and also for women's rights and gay rights in particular, I'm struck by the distance that exists between your method of bringing about this emancipation and the methods that are now considered to be, are now more prevalent, frankly, in both the world of legal scholarship and in the world of queer theory. To begin with the legal point, there's now, I think, a clear understanding that any kind of effective legal change cannot impose universal solutions. Eric Posner, the Chicago law professor, for example, talks about this in his book, The Twilight of International Human Rights, comparing
Who is it?
Eric Posner, the...
Posner?
Yeah.
He's a right-winger.
No, Eric
Oh,
Posner.
really?
Yeah. Talks about this in his, the Chicago law professor talks about this in his, not to be confused with the judge in the New York court, different fellow. Talks about, compares this with international aid, right? Where the old model used to be that you could go in, impose the same kind of solution for all these, for all these developing countries, and that historically has always failed. And what international aid now does is look at a very specific intervention it can make in a very specific situation, say, well, this is how we can help here, and this solution can't be replicated and duplicated, elsewhere, because there are particular problems in particular contexts. So it seems to me your kind of universalizing view of this emancipatory project might, have its own limitations. Secondly, particularly because you invoked the gay rights issue, I'm interested in, because clearly once you start looking at queer theory and queer literature, there are subcultures in gay life where, for example, there is an explicit idea that you are supposed to conform your body to certain ideational practices, right? And if you fail, you kind of do it again until you become comfortable with it. Tim Dean's book Unlimited Intimacy actually points this out in the context of sadomasochism and other forms of. So, right, there is this idea actually in queer theory in particular that you do create a kind of body and you do have an ideational a sense of where you want the body to go. And if you fail the first time to make your body sort of conform to those ideational values, then you keep trying until you get there. Again, I'm just struck by the dissonance of, having identified yourself as an activist and somebody who's interested in this emancipatory project, can you not see how imbricated it is with imperialism?
So it's
Can we take, because there are two more questions and we're running out of time, this way we can maybe sum up also. There is Hassan here and Bashar at the end.
This is to Mr. Iqbal. Thank you for the talk, very stimulating. Either I misunderstood you or maybe I understood you right, then you might answer my question. You're saying let's look at the different forms of life that the Ummah takes and put to the side the essential qualities that some might try to look for or have tried to look for in the past. if this is, at least on the conceptual level, this is your program, how does this fare with the fact that those who are looking for the concept of Ummah are precisely looking for that essence to transcend the ruination, the dispersion, the immigration, etc.?
بالمختصر لمدام لما بالنسبة هون بلبنان وغير لبنان بعرف إنه مصر حضرتك وهيدا بس بالإجمال لأنه جو ماكسكوز منك مصرية بس عم بحكي إنه لأن هلا بهالجلسة كان أكثر شيء عن مصر. بالمختصر هل الحجاب والنقاب وكل ما تلبسه المرأة المسلمة هو مفروض ومتوجب دينيا، يعني حسب الشريعة الإسلامية يجب أن تكون بهذه الألبسة، وخاصة النقاب الذي يغطي الوجه وغيره اللي رأينا صور عنه بمداخلة إحدى المحاضرات اللي شفتوها وعملت مقارنة، بفتكر اليوم شفتوها. هيدا كتير مهم بالنسبة لنا، مش بالنسبة لإلي إذا أنا مسلمة أو غير مسلمة، بالنسبة للمرأة عامة بهيدا العصر اللي نحن عايشين فيه. جاية حسب مجبورة حسب الشريعة الإسلامية وحسب ما جاء في الكتاب المقدس الإسلامي اللي هو القرآن، متوجب عليها. نرى أن هنالك نساء مسلمات غير محجبات ولا شيء وهن مسلمات. إذا في توضيح كون ممنونتك. Thank you.
Yes, last question, Dr. Haider in the corner.
I'm not familiar with the works of Mas'ad and Mahmoud directly, only through the grapevines, and indirectly, and talks like this, which are not very flattering of their work. But my question is more general about, I feel, and I want to know that that feeling is correct. Is there a kind of a general relativism lurking behind their work? And if there is it a general consistent one, or is it only opportunistic one? In the sense, do they apply the same kind of analyses to social conservatism in the US for those who are anti-gay rights and are skeptical of the say Me Too movements and attempts to generate more substantive equality? So I wonder whether there is such a thing as relativism. Is it articulated? This kind of a closed epistemology suggests something like that you cannot actually have access from outside. You have to enter their discourse, which means some kind of relativism. Is that something they are aware of and they defend, as the old anthropologists used to do? Defend their relativism openly? Or is it something lurking behind? Or is it because it's opportunistic relativism, it's not articulated, and therefore, because it's not consistently applied? So that's the question.
Thank you. So we'll start with Basit for the answer and concluding comment.
So yes, thank you for the question. I think there's often, I think, two different ways of approaching like a social scientific project kind of available on offer, or maybe two maybe dominant paradigms. So one is that, you're looking for one is that often historically, you're searching for one particular thing and how it travels through succeeding historical contexts. And so this would be how, how you might say, I want to look for, the Ummah in one period, and then look at what the Ummah becomes in another period and see what connection there is between the two things, if there is one, and then kind of proceed through succeeding historical contexts in kind of a linear history. And then the other option that's often available is that, through some kind of phenomenological bracketing, you want to say, I'm not interested in whether there is a real ummah there. I just want to look at how certain Muslims invoke the ummah or think about the ummah or kind of have practices related to the ummah, and that'll be enough. And that's what lots of anthropology does as well. I think what I maybe started gesturing toward in the beginning, in that overlong methodological prelude, but maybe it wasn't clear enough, was that I'm trying to step aside from both of these modes of not investigation or whatnot, but instead begin with the present instead of assuming a linear history that the same thing kind of proceeds through, and then consider how different temporalities are already present there in that moment or in that practice, and how the present and how time past is also present there in various ways, how the future is also implicated, and without the presumption that that the same object necessarily existed, right? And so there's a proximity to that anti-historicist practice. There's a proximity to kind of the phenomenological bracketing of essence, maybe in that social scientific practice, but that's not quite the same thing as what I was trying to do. And so I had that quote kind of talking about how we must attend to the way time present is separated from, but also included within events and epochs, to understand how agents inhabit different kinds of time simultaneously and straddle the gap between experience and expectation. And so I guess methodologically, I'm trying to begin with the present and then think about how inhabiting a certain form of life within that already draws in the past and the future in different ways. So, thank you.
Okay, so I forget your name. Abdurrahman. So the human rights point, right? That it's if I were enough of a crit, I would know that the wisdom has settled that human rights is already being critiqued as too universalistic and therefore not useful. I think that is actually a Euro-American wisdom that has settled on that. And I know it's driven by some idea that there has to be something that's either more local or more radical that's being ignored by an international human rights discourse. But there is enormous pushback by people from, to use another critical word, the South, the global South, who say this idea that human rights is not useful just is not looking at our experience. I mean, most people in the Arab world who use international human rights discourse are actually very progressive, quite radical activists who resort to it because it's the most effective way of asserting what they want. So one of the critical critiques in Euro-American academia that rights are not political. Well, here, our life is so political that resorting to right is exactly what you want to do. Invoking universalist language as a way to embarrass your oppressor is the only way to go, all right? So it's been actually a very radical way to move, and it's been done at the hands of people who are very progressive. And if you mean by an alternative something that's Islamic, we don't have a radical Islamic that's on the left. Every radical Islamic gets you to the right. That idea that there's a radical Islamic that's to the left does not exist on the spectrum of our political discourse here. It just doesn't. The best you can get is a liberal Muslim. You can't get anything. That's just the diasporic Muslims have come up with this sort of merging the Islamic with the radical that we just don't see in our lives. It doesn't exist. As to queer theory, of course there are I mean, why go to the sadomasochistic practices as an example? Let's just go run with Judith Butler. I, as a woman, perform femininity, and I want to reach its ideal. That's what gender means according to the theory. However, right, the theorists try to identify moments of failure in order to say something about that ideal, right, in order to critique it. And that move is not anywhere in Sabah Mahmoud's discourse about the women of piety. As to the relativism question, I think they're deeply relativistic. And I think that they fall in contradiction the whole time. That's my reading of them. But I think you need to ask the anthropologists who study, for whom these are mentors. But as an outsider, they are in a constant contradiction. They want to defend social conservatism on Muslim terms, but they hate its equivalent in the West. And the problem, of course, is that Islamophobia is emerging from these quarters, but there is an incredibly a deep belief that there is an authentic Islam that is at the risk of the West constantly, that has to be defended, whose borders have to be policed. Joseph Massad is just borders on the neurotic in doing that. Yeah, Fuad.
On that note, let me say, Fuad,
Your mentors.
I would like to thank the panelists and to thank the audience for this wonderful discussion. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
هلا اذا بدك تسالي جاوبك هون.